Today's story is for the quiet fighters, the ones who stand firm when it would be easier to fold. You are the backbone of this country, and it's your spirit that this story honors. We're about to revisit a powerful moment when a young woman stepped onto one of America's biggest stages, not with anger, but with dignity, and reminded the nation what true courage looks like. Stay with us, you're going to be proud you did. It was just after dawn when the email arrived, slipping quietly into Karoline Leavitt's inbox like a hand-delivered letter before a storm. At first glance it looked innocuous, a polite official invitation to appear on a special live edition of The Ellen DeGeneres Show, hosted at the Grand Dolby Theatre in Los Angeles. The subject line read simply, "Generation Crossroads, a conversation about America." But Karoline had been in politics long enough to know that in Washington and in Hollywood, words were weapons disguised as gifts. Sitting in her modest D.C. office, her silver cross necklace catching the early morning light, she read the invitation again, slower this time. Conversation, it said. Not debate, not ambush. Conversation. Yet the way the phrase Generation Crossroads was framed, the way Ellen's name was highlighted in bold, told a different story. It wasn't just an invitation, it was a test, a gauntlet thrown with a smile. Her chief communications advisor, Maddie Lorne, burst into the room minutes later, reading the email over her shoulder. "They want to clash," Maddie said flatly. "They'll paint it like a friendly chat, but you'll be the villain before you sit down." Karoline didn't answer right away. She sat back in her chair, running a thumb along the worn corner of her pocket-sized Constitution, a quiet habit when she was thinking. She could already hear the voices that would warn her off. Don't give Hollywood a free shot. Don't risk it. Let it go. But that's never how Karoline had operated. Not when she put herself through college on scholarships and part-time jobs. Not when she stood at the White House podium for the first time, under the searing lights, younger than almost anyone who had ever done it. She had never been handed safe ground. She had earned every inch she stood on. "Let her try," Karoline said simply, sliding her laptop shut. Her voice was calm, but there was a steel edge underneath that only those who knew her well could hear. Maddie shook her head, half admiring, half anxious. "They're going to come smiling," she warned, "but they'll be setting traps." Karoline offered a small smile of her own, the kind that didn't need noise to make its point. "If they want to fight," she said quietly, reaching for her travel bag, "they'll find someone who came ready to stand, not swing." Within the hour, travel arrangements were underway. As the team prepared, conservative circles buzzed with warnings. Liberal commentators, catching whispers of the taping, began sharpening their jokes. In Los Angeles, Ellen's producers tightened the script. Clever barbs, pointed questions, segments designed to stir laughter at Karoline's expense. But across the country, in a small D.C. office filled with the quiet hum of purpose, Karoline Leavitt didn't prepare jokes. She prepared truth. She packed, not just facts, but principles. Not just talking points, but conviction. As she boarded her flight westward later that afternoon, she wasn't just carrying a message. She was carrying the weight of millions who had been laughed at, dismissed, and told their beliefs belonged to a bygone era. They had invited her for a spectacle. She was coming to give them something they wouldn't be ready for. Respect, unshakable and unapologetic, and if necessary, a reckoning. The night before her flight to Los Angeles, Karoline Leavitt sat alone in her small apartment near Capitol Hill, the city's late-night numb muted by the thick curtains drawn tightly across the windows. In front of her, a slim binder sat open on the dining table, printouts of Ellen's past interviews, news clippings, audience demographics, notes scribbled in the margins. But Karoline wasn't just preparing for questions, she was preparing for the unspoken battle that would unfold between the jokes and applause lines. She knew the real fight wasn't over facts or policy, it was about narrative. It was about whether a young conservative woman of faith could walk into the stronghold of celebrity culture and still walk out with her dignity intact. She glanced over at her travel bag, half-packed with basics, a deep blue blouse, her worn cross necklace, a few handwritten quotes she had jotted down from Lincoln, Chesterton, and Reagan, words that steadied her when the noise grew loud. Maddie Lorne, her chief communications advisor, called late to check in. "Sure you're ready?" Maddie asked, her voice laced with concern. "They're not coming for a conversation. They're coming for a takedown, Karoline." Karoline smiled faintly, the kind of smile reserved for moments when doubt tried to whisper. "I'm not going there to win their applause," she said quietly. "I'm going there so people who believe what I believe know they aren't alone." Before turning in for the night, Karoline pulled out the small Bible she kept tucked away in her nightstand, an old edition from her college years, its cover cracked at the edges. She read a passage from Isaiah, steadying herself not for combat but for clarity. She wasn't bracing for a fight, she was anchoring for a moment of truth. In a world where so many chased approval, she had learned young that it was better to chase principle, even when the crowd booed, especially when the crowd booed. At midnight, she snapped the binder shut and slid it into her bag, next to the Constitution she carried, almost like a shield. She didn't rehearse sound bites, she didn't script retorts. Instead, she packed herself with something far stronger: patience, faith, and the absolute certainty that if she spoke quietly but stood firmly, no amount of laughter could move her off the ground she was called to stand on. The plane touched down at LAX just after noon, its wheels skimming the tarmac with a shudder that seemed almost prophetic. Karoline Leavitt stepped off the jet bridge into a sea of noise, flashing screens, and hurried faces. Los Angeles greeted her not with open arms, but with the unmistakable shimmer of a city built on performance, where smiles were currency and truth was negotiable. Her driver, a man in a sleek black blazer holding a tablet with her name spelled wrong, Karoline Leavitt, gave her a curt nod and a perfunctory handshake. No one here knew her story. No one here cared. In this world, people didn't earn platforms by standing still under pressure, they earned them by playing along. As the car pulled away from the airport and sped toward Hollywood Boulevard, Karoline watched the towering billboards slide past. Glossy faces, glossy slogans, promises wrapped in bright lights. Somewhere behind all that spectacle, the Dolby Theatre waited. She had seen it before on television, always framed in gold and celebration. Actors, musicians, cultural giants walking its red carpet, swaddled in applause. But she knew, as the car weaved through the glittering streets, that she wasn't being brought there to be celebrated. She was being brought there to be displayed, questioned, and, if the producers had their way, quietly humiliated, for sport. The driver dropped her at a side entrance, away from the tourist gawkers and camera crews setting up out front. A production assistant barely older than a college intern met her with a clipboard and a hollow smile. "Right this way," he chirped, leading her through narrow back corridors lined with posters of past glories. Karoline walked silently, her heels clicking steadily on the marble floors, her silver cross necklace catching the occasional glint from the overhead lights. She could feel it. The air itself was different here, lighter, faster, more charged with the need to impress and conform. As she approached the green room, she passed a dressing mirror and caught her reflection for a moment, poised, calm, her blue blouse crisp against the sterile backdrop of celebrity machinery. She wasn't here to blend in, she wasn't here to smile on cue, she was here to stand. And in a place built to polish away the edges, Karoline Leavitt would be walking on stage with her edges sharp, her roots deep, and her faith gleaming just quietly enough to make the bright light seem dim by comparison. She wasn't on enemy ground, she was on sacred ground. Because wherever you carried truth without shame, the ground was already yours. The applause thundered through the Dolby Theatre as Ellen DeGeneres stepped onto the stage, all practiced charm and effortless showmanship. She wore her signature smile, the one that had launched 1,000 standing ovations, and waved broadly to the crowd. The set gleamed under cool, flattering lights, every camera poised to capture the perfect moment of camaraderie and good humor. Karoline Leavitt stood just off stage, her heart steady, her mind clear. When Ellen called her name, the cheers softened, still enthusiastic but with an undercurrent of curiosity, even tension. Karoline walked into the spotlight with a calm stride, dressed not for flash but for purpose. Deep blue blouse, silver cross at her collarbone, and the posture of someone who had decided long before today that applause would never define her. Ellen greeted her warmly, almost maternally, with a hug that felt staged down to the millisecond. "Welcome, Karoline," she beamed. "We don't often get young White House officials braving Hollywood." The audience laughed on cue. Karoline returned the smile politely, but her eyes stayed steady. She knew the rules of this game. Make 'em laugh, soften them up, and then slip in the blade with a wink. The early small talk was harmless enough. Jokes about East Coast weather, nods to Karoline's age and ambition, but as the conversation eased forward, Ellen's questions took a sharper edge. "You're young, brilliant," Ellen said sweetly, "and you're working for one of the most controversial figures in modern history. Don't you ever wonder if you're just reading someone else's script?" The audience chuckled, the barb tucked neatly inside the compliment. Karoline didn't blink. She leaned in slightly, her voice as smooth as glass. "Actually, Ellen," she said, "I've been writing my own story since college, and I don't need a teleprompter or applause to live it." A ripple moved through the room. Not laughter, not quite applause, but a pause. The practiced flow stumbled just for a second. Ellen recovered quickly, flashing that wide grin again. "Touche," she said, tapping her note cards. "But let's be real. When you speak for someone like Donald Trump, doesn't that come with a heavy suitcase?" There it was. The pivot. The carefully staged moment where the friendly patter would tilt into something else. Karoline sat straighter, not defensive but grounded. "If by heavy suitcase you mean standing for economic strength, secure borders, and pride in America," she said evenly, "then yes, I carry it gladly." A smattering of applause rose from scattered corners of the audience. Small, but real. Karoline saw Ellen's smile tighten at the edges. The dance was ending. The duel had begun. The lights above the stage seemed to sharpen, casting a cool glow across the polished floor. Ellen DeGeneres leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs casually, her smile still in place but her tone shifting, inch by inch, from pointed to pointed. "You know, Karoline," she said, voice light but laced with something harder underneath, "I couldn't help but notice that little cross you wear." She gestured toward the silver necklace that caught the stage lights with every breath Karoline took. "It's sweet," Ellen added with a twinkle of mockery, "but don't you think it's a bit old-fashioned for someone leading the next generation?" Few audience members chuckled, a low, knowing laughter, the kind designed not to invite but to exclude. Karoline sat perfectly still, her fingers resting lightly on the armrest of her chair. She had been expecting this. She had seen it before, dressed up as wit, paraded as modernity, the quiet contempt for faith, the sideways smirk at something millions of Americans still held sacred. She didn't rush her answer. She didn't fumble or flinch. She let the silence stretch just long enough for the discomfort to grow, for the laughter to wilt, and then she spoke. Her voice low, steady, and unmistakably clear. "Faith," she said slowly, "isn't a fashion statement. It's not something you wear to fit in or take off when it's out of style. It's the thread that weaves families together. It's the reason soldiers bow their heads before battle. It's why parents pray over their children when the world feels too big. It's why small towns still gather on Sunday mornings, even when nobody's watching." The audience quieted. The air shifted. "And for millions of Americans," Karoline continued, her hand brushing lightly over the cross at her collarbone, "faith isn't something old-fashioned. It's something eternal." Across the theater, some audience members shifted in their seats. A few heads nodded instinctively, almost in spite of themselves. Ellen blinked, her next line caught halfway to her lips. Karoline didn't stop there. Her voice deepened, not in volume but in weight. "In this country, we used to understand that faith wasn't a punchline, it was a pillar. It's what carried our ancestors through valleys of loss, wars, depressions, and doubt. And if today's culture finds that funny, She paused, letting the stillness fill the space between them. Then maybe it's not my necklace that's outdated. Maybe it's our memory of what truly holds us together. A murmur rippled through the room. Not laughter, not jeering. Something older, something heavier. Respect, maybe. Recognition. Ellen shifted in her chair, visibly searching for a way to recover the rhythm. She let out a small, forced chuckle. "Well, you sure came prepared," she said, her hands tapping lightly on her note cards, but it didn't land. The easy laughter Ellen had always summoned with a smirk and a wink wasn't there this time, because for the first time that afternoon, the audience wasn't playing along. They were listening, really listening. Backstage, a producer leaned closer to the control panel, murmuring into his headset, "She's flipping the room." Karoline sat back, her hands folding neatly in her lap, not triumphant, not smug, just certain. She hadn't raised her voice, she hadn't lashed out, she had simply anchored herself in something deeper than showmanship. And somewhere, quietly but unmistakably, the tide began to turn. Ellen DeGeneres shifted again in her chair, her smile tight, her cue cards shuffling nervously between her fingers. The laughter she usually summoned with ease had thinned into a strained silence. Still, she pressed on, reaching for the old reliable tactic, framing Karoline not as an individual but as a mouthpiece. "Look," Ellen said, adopting a faux-friendly tone. "It's easy to talk about ideals when you're working from someone else's playbook. Don't you think you're just another echo of Washington's spin?" The question floated in the air, baited and barbed. But Karoline didn't bite. She simply reached down, pulling from under her chair a neatly folded sheet of paper, a public transcript, printed in clear black and white. She unfolded it slowly, deliberately, the soft crinkle of the paper magnified by the stillness of the room. "Funny you mention that, Ellen," she said with a quiet firmness, "because in 2018, you sat on this very stage and praised President Trump's economic plan for bringing factory jobs back to Middle America. You called it unexpected progress for working families." Gasps rippled through the audience like a sudden breeze. Ellen's eyes widened a fraction, and for the first time her fingers fumbled slightly with her cue cards. Karoline didn't gloat. She didn't press the moment with theatrics. Instead, she folded the paper neatly and set it on the side table between them, as if laying down a piece of evidence at the bench of public conscience. "I'm not here to spin anything," she said, her voice even. "I'm here to remind people that truth doesn't change just because politics do." For a long second, Ellen said nothing. She opened her mouth to respond, but found no immediate retort that wouldn't sound defensive. The crowd, sensing the shift, leaned in. No staged applause, no laugh track, just raw attention. Karoline leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped, her posture open but unyielding. "You ask me how I can defend where I stand," she said, her voice steady. "I ask how anyone can mock what they themselves once knew was right, simply because the winds of popularity shifted." The words struck harder than a shout would have. They stripped away the gloss and showmanship, leaving only two people on a stage, one trying to recover a script, and one standing quietly in the center of her conviction. Somewhere backstage, a producer muttered into a headset, "We're losing the room." But Karoline wasn't thinking about the producers. She wasn't thinking about the headlines. She was thinking about the millions of Americans who had lost their jobs, lost their communities, and been told by the very architects of celebrity culture that their struggles and now their faith were jokes to be told for ratings. Not today. Not on her watch. For a moment after Karoline's quiet rebuttal, the Dolby Theatre seemed frozen in time. Ellen DeGeneres flipped through her cue cards as if searching for a lifeline, but the room had slipped from her grasp. The energy that once danced so easily at her fingertips, laughs, cheers, the warm rush of an approving crowd, now hung heavy, uncertain. It was subtle at first. A few audience members shifted in their seats, uncrossing their arms, leaning forward, not laughing, not jeering, just listening, really listening, for the first time that afternoon. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. The show was built for rhythm and control. A joke here, a softball question there, a well-timed zinger to keep the audience laughing and the guest wobbling. But Karoline Leavitt hadn't wobbled. She hadn't even blinked. She had turned the weapon of mockery into a mirror and held it gently but unflinchingly in front of the audience itself. And slowly, that audience, young and old, left and right, began to see something familiar. Not a political operative, not a partisan gladiator, but something rare. Steadiness, principle, unapologetic faith. Then, without warning, it happened. From backstage, a voice called out, young, clear, cutting through the awkwardness. "She's not wrong." Heads turned sharply. It was Brian Tate, one of the younger lighting technicians who had grown up in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio. A town that had seen its factories close and its community halls empty, while politicians in cities like this one talked about progress. His voice cracked something open in the room. A few people clapped, hesitant at first but real, then a few more. It wasn't the thunderous, orchestrated applause that daytime audiences were trained to give. It was ragged, genuine. It was the sound of something deeper than politics, recognition, respect. Ellen's smile faltered. She tried to make a joke, waving dismissively, but it floated awkwardly into the silence. For the first time on her own stage, she wasn't leading the energy of the room. She was reacting to it. Karoline didn't move. She didn't bask in it. She didn't smirk or posture. She simply folded her hands in her lap and let the truth breathe. Her stillness spoke louder than 1,000 slogans. In homes across America, veterans watching in quiet living rooms, churchgoers catching the live stream between Sunday services, retired factory workers sipping coffee at corner diners, there would be a different kind of murmur that day. Not outrage, not noise, just a quiet, powerful realization. Maybe they weren't as forgotten as the world tried to make them feel. In that moment, Karoline Leavitt wasn't a press secretary, she wasn't a talking head, she was a mirror, reflecting a dignity too long sneered at, and reminding a nation that courage doesn't always come with noise. Sometimes it comes with silence that refuses to yield. Ellen shifted in her chair again, masking her discomfort behind a quick, brittle laugh. "Well," she said, voice lighter than her eyes, "this got more serious than I intended. We brought you here for understanding, Karoline, not for a showdown." She smiled thinly, gesturing toward the audience as if to remind everyone that this was still her stage, still her show. The crowd murmured uncertainly, sensing the cracks beneath the polished surface. Karoline didn't flinch, she didn't gloat, she didn't even lean forward. She simply met Ellen's gaze calmly, the quiet weight of the moment pressing around her. "Then maybe next time," Karoline said, her voice low but carrying easily through the room, "start with a question, not a punchline." The words landed with a weight heavier than any shouted accusation. A few audience members clapped, scattered at first, but sincere. Ellen tried to regain her footing, pivoting quickly. "Surely," she said, forcing a grin, "there's something we can agree on, like joy, or laughter, or hope for a better country." Her tone was pleading now, reaching for safe territory. Karoline offered a small, steady smile, not cruel, not triumphant, just sure. "Of course," she said. "I believe Americans are desperate for honesty, and tired of shows pretending to have it." The applause this time was sharper, louder. It wasn't unanimous, but it was strong enough to slice through the stage lights and bounce off the velvet walls of the great theater. Ellen's practiced smile cracked at the edges. She nodded stiffly, moving to shuffle her cards, but her hands trembled slightly. Karoline stayed seated, her posture unshaken. She had not raised her voice once. She had not needed to. The power wasn't in the volume, it was in the substance, and the room, whether it wanted to admit it or not, knew it. In that moment, Karoline Leavitt didn't just win a point, she redefined the battlefield. It wasn't about clever comebacks. It wasn't about television ratings. It was about the simple, stubborn truth that kindness without accountability is just empty performance, and that real courage means refusing to apologize for standing firm when the world expects you to fold. The cameras cut to commercial, but the shift in the Dolby Theatre didn't end when the lights dimmed. It traveled outward, through cell phone cameras, backstage whispers, and the quiet buzz that followed Karoline Leavitt as she exited the stage without fanfare. Within an hour, the first clip surfaced online. Karoline adjusting her silver cross, speaking without raising her voice, delivering that final, piercing line, "Maybe next time, start with a question, not a punchline." By nightfall, it wasn't just trending, it was exploding. Karoline Clapsback flooded Twitter. Facebook feeds filled with clips from conservative veterans, small-town pastors, suburban grandmothers, and even moderate voices who usually stayed silent. At a diner in Scranton, Pennsylvania, two retired factory workers watched the clip in stunned silence. One put down his coffee, nodded once, and said, "She didn't yell, she didn't stomp her feet, she just stood there." At a church community center in rural Ohio, a group of volunteers gathering canned goods replayed the video, murmuring approval at her composure. On talk radio across America, hosts marveled not just at the confrontation itself, but at how Karoline had handled it, with unshakable calm, clarity, and respect for the millions whose faith and values were so often ridiculed in mainstream culture. Ellen's team, realizing the disaster unfolding, scrambled to control the narrative. A vague, half-hearted statement about respecting all viewpoints was quietly released, but it rang hollow. The audience wasn't buying it. For once, it wasn't just the conservative base rallying, it was independents, disillusioned Democrats, and ordinary Americans who simply recognized authenticity when they saw it. Television segments aired coast to coast. Newspapers that normally ignored figures like Karoline ran headlines. Karoline Leavitt turns the tables at Dolby Theatre. Young press secretary redefines grace under fire. More than the viral hashtags, it was the letters that told the real story. Karoline's office inbox filled overnight. Notes from retired teachers, veterans, small business owners, even college students from liberal campuses, thanking her for showing what it meant to stand firm without shouting. One letter from a retired Navy chaplain simply read, "You spoke for the quiet ones today." Karoline didn't throw a victory party. She didn't go on a media blitz. She sat quietly with her team that evening, watching the ripple grow, knowing something bigger had begun. For once, America hadn't just witnessed a viral moment, they had witnessed a movement, the silent majority realizing that courage could be quiet, faith could be public, and dignity could still win without ever raising its voice. 1 week later, Karoline Leavitt stood backstage at the National Values Summit in Dallas, the roar of a packed crowd vibrating through the walls. Nearly 20,000 people had gathered, not just to see a young press secretary, but to stand with what she had stood for. As she adjusted her simple cross necklace, the same one that had quietly sparked a national conversation, she thought not of the confrontation with Ellen, not of the viral clips or the media frenzy, but of the quiet letters tucked into her briefcase. Letters from ordinary Americans who had found courage again in her calm defiance. When she finally stepped onto the stage, the ovation was deafening. But Karoline didn't rush to the podium or soak in the applause. She walked steadily, her hands folded, her gaze steady. She waited for the room to quiet before she spoke. When she did, her voice was low, sure, and full of something deeper than pride. Full of purpose. "Some said I went too far," she began. "Others said I didn't go far enough. But the truth is, I didn't step onto that stage to win a fight. I stepped there to remind America that your faith, your values, and your voice are not relics of the past. They are the foundation of our future." The crowd erupted again, but Karoline lifted a hand, gently, and the room quieted. "This isn't the end," she said. "It's the beginning. The beginning of a country that remembers who it is, not because of a headline, but because of the quiet strength of its people." And with that, she stepped back from the podium, not as a guest, not as a viral sensation, but as a symbol of something enduring. The silent majority had found its voice again, and it wasn't shouting. It was standing. The story of Karoline Leavitt's quiet stand on one of America's most visible stages teaches us a powerful lesson. True strength doesn't shout. It endures. In a world addicted to outrage and applause, Karoline showed that dignity, faith, and principle still have the power to turn a room, move a nation, and inspire a silent majority that refuses to be erased. She reminded us that kindness without truth is hollow, and that defending your beliefs with calm certainty speaks louder than any insult or mockery. Karoline didn't come to argue. She came to represent millions who still bow their heads in prayer, stand for the flag, and work hard without demanding recognition. And when she faced ridicule, she answered, not with anger, but with clarity and conviction. In a culture that often tries to shame faith, tradition, and patriotism into silence, Karoline Leavitt's example calls us all to remember: strength rooted in principle can still change the conversation. And sometimes, the quietest voice in the room is the one that echoes the longest.